Religion can be a tumultuous topic. It has been the death knell for amity in family gatherings, and in a completely different way has caused the collapse of many a solid fantasy world build. In this video, we'll avoid the former and focus squarely on the latter: how to develop religions that are coherent, fully integrated, and believable within their worlds. Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg. I'm the author of the fantasy novel Tears from Iron. I have been world building for over 25 years now, and I'm rolling out these videos to help you with tips and tricks that I've found along the way, and avoid some of the pitfalls that have snared me. This video is one of two I'm releasing on religion in fantasy worlds. In this one, we'll discuss how to create internally consistent and plausible religious beliefs for your world. In the other, we'll explore the ramifications of religion on broader societal behavior and structures. Adjacent to this topic, last summer I released a pair of videos on creation titled Who Holds the Truth of Creation and The 4 Creation Questions That Shape Every Fantasy World. They're linked in the description, and I'll reference them occasionally when we parallel cosmogony today. As we get started, I want to address two big elephants in the room. Any discussion of fantasy in world building requires us to look to our own world for reference points. And that carries with it the potential for the same tensions as those family gathering blowups we want to avoid. But this topic is critically important for developing believable worlds. To maintain the integrity of our works, we must be willing to grapple with subjects that can be divisive or uncomfortable. So the first elephant. I will be respectful of all religions, including those that I don't believe in, and I ask that you do the same in the comments. Let's extend each other grace and kindness as we world build better worlds. Second, we all bring our own perspectives to this topic. So you better understand mine. I will tell you that I am a devout Christian. I won't be proselytizing Christianity in this video, but since it is the faith I know best, I will be using it for many of our real-world examples. Okay, with that out of the way, let's roll up our sleeves and get into the fun stuff. When looking at religion, we first need to make sure we have a shared understanding of terms, specifically the difference between faith and religion. Other important terms will crop up along the way, but these two are foundational, so they deserve some special attention. When I say faith, I mean what a person actually believes in his heart. As a Christian, for example, I believe that Jesus is God and that he died on the cross for our sins. Ancient Egyptians believed that proper worship and sacrifices would ensure that the Nile flooded correctly in season. The ancient Norse believed that Odin granted victory to favored warriors. Every person has their own faith concerning what they believe is true. I cannot prove scientifically that the death of Christ on the cross absolves my sins, nor could the ancient Egyptians prove that their sacrifices to Hapi brought the Nile floods, or the Norse that Odin gave Harald Fairhair triumph over rival chieftains at the Battle of Havarsfjord. When contemplating faith in the context of world building, the most important thing to remember is that faith is individual. It is internal. In contrast to that, religion extends beyond the individual. Religion is the structure, the organization and corporate manifestation of a faith, a belief, concerning the metaphysical uncertainties of our world. While faith is internal, religion is external. This typically manifests in shared practices, formalization of beliefs, hierarchical structures, and integration within, or rebellion against, society. The primary focus of this video is going to be on that faith aspect, what the beliefs actually are. The next video will focus much more heavily upon religion, how that system of beliefs interconnects with the broader world. Of course, nothing involving humans is quite as neat and simple as this, so some religion will crop up here and some faith next time, but hopefully you get the idea. Going forward, I will endeavor to use both terms per these definitions. If they bleed together, as can often happen, I will default to religion. As we continue with this video, for simplicity's sake, I am going to proceed with the assumption that religions are centered on a deity or deities. I know there are some beliefs in our world that don't necessarily adhere to this. As a result, some of this discussion won't apply in every case, but much of it still will, depending upon the nature of the faiths in your world. Must there be religion in your fantasy world? The short answer is no. You can make your fantasy world whatever you want it to be. That said, if your goal is a plausible world that doesn't require suspension of disbelief, the answer will almost always be yes. fundamentally, humans are curious creatures. We look at the world and wonder why it is the way it is. The answer to these questions may be given directly by God, or a collection of gods, imparted by prophets, or be born of myths and legends lost to the sands of time. It may be built upon spiritual, metaphysical, and/or scientific foundations. Speaking simply, each of these faiths is a theory about the answers to these great questions. This also means that atheism functions as a faith, since the existence or non-existence of a god or gods cannot be definitively proven. Taking this to its logical conclusion, if the inhabitants of your fantasy world are curious, they'll inevitably contemplate these grand metaphysical questions, and faith will be born. Once faith exists, these ideas will be shared, and people with common beliefs will almost certainly establish religions to formalize them, preserve the truth, and help one another adhere to its precepts. But this is an external view of the situation, from you, the world builder. Looking internally, faith and then religion may arise in the opposite way depending upon what the absolute truth of your world is. For example, Tolkien's elves were approached by Orome and other Valar, who instructed them about Iluvatar and the nature of the world. Even if the elves hadn't been curious, they still would have been introduced to faith and religion. The elves did not literally see Iluvatar or witness the creation of the world before their awakening besides Cuivianen, so they accepted what the Valar told them on faith. In this case, curiosity wasn't necessary. The knowledge was imparted by an outside source. This confusion of world builder's perspective and world inhabitant's perspective is the biggest mistake you can make when designing faiths in fantasy worlds. One we'll explore more deeply later in this video. That said, a plausible world can lack faith and religion, but only if it meets one of two narrow conditions. The first is if the peoples of your world have no curiosity, and no one shares an unprovable theory. The second occurs if the people of your world don't need faith at all, because they have the absolute and irrefutable answer to these metaphysical questions. For this to work, they must know why the world exists, their place in it, and its purpose, or lack thereof. Perhaps because they witnessed creation firsthand. I suspect neither of these options will appeal to most of us, because they strip away much of the wonder that makes fantasy, well, fantasy. So now we get into the meat of the conversation. There is one cornerstone upon which any plausible religion must rest: incentive. Members of a religion must have a reason to participate in it. Put crudely, what do you get out of it? If there's nothing to be gained, a person may hold a belief, they may have a faith, but they won't act on it in a way that produces religion. For example, if I believe the universe was created by a giant whale that burped up its lunch and then swam away, I wouldn't worship that whale. There's no benefit to be gained by doing so. It might inform my worldview, perhaps to my detriment if I saw everything just as a regurgitated lunch. But in a religious corporate sense, there would be no reason to establish the Church of the Digestically Distressed Whale. I don't like the term incentive because it cheapens the sacred interaction between believers and their God. Those within the religion, both the deity or deities, and the worshippers, likely wouldn't view it that way at all. In Christianity, for example, it isn't simply a matter of saying, "Hey God, I believe in you, now please save me." It is God approaching humanity and establishing a covenant, divine in origin, not human-directed, and includes greater purposes that can't even be fully comprehended by believers themselves. Yet in the end, Christians believe God will welcome them into heaven after death. In Roman paganism, to provide another example, it was believed that sacrifices were necessary to keep the gods happy. Failure to perform the proper rituals and other corporate duties invited disaster, famine, defeat in battle, plague, and so on. Let's explore the idea of what faith, and sometimes religion, actually offers. Broadly speaking, this interaction manifests itself in one of two ways, sometimes both. The first is aid in this life, or at least avoidance of harm, and the second is aid after death. Romans believed proper rites would be rewarded with victory in battle and the ongoing flourishing of the state. But they didn't link their beliefs to the afterlife. While they believed there was an afterlife, their fate beyond the grave wasn't generally affected by faith or religious practices. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Christianity doesn't promise prosperity in this life, only salvation in the next, though some sects would certainly disagree. Let's look at Zoroastrianism as a third example. I'm hardly an expert, but my understanding is that it offers blessings in both this life and the next. We'll come back to this interactive element in a bit, but first we need to consider how powerful the deities of your world are. While there are countless gradations, I'm going to focus on a few core varieties. I've created my own terms for each. They are in descending order: omnipotent, primordial, regnant, and ascendant. Let's explore each of them. An omnipotent god, or more rarely, gods, is all-powerful. Given that absolute power, he is typically the source of creation and exercises total control over it. The Christian God is a good example. He is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. By primordial gods, I mean deities who also exist outside of creation, but aren't quite as powerful as omnipotent ones. From this tier onward, we're more likely to encounter multiple gods rather than a single deity. Zoroastrianism fits reasonably well here, with its opposing divine forces locked in eternal conflict. If either were omnipotent, the struggle would cease. Another example is the Titans of Greek mythology. They existed outside the natural order and created the cosmos, but weren't all-powerful. Indeed, many ended up being banished by Olympian usurpers. Regnant gods exist within creation. They can be very powerful, but they are within the confines of the created order. The Celtic deities are a good fit here. They didn't create the world, but they are extremely powerful within it, each with a defined dominion, such as Lu over war, kingship, and light, Daga over fertility, life, and death, and Brigid over poetry, smithing, and healing. Finally, we have ascendant gods. These are powerful beings, but theirs is an achievable power. Great heroes, powerful sorcerers, demagogues, and the like might join, replace, or even usurp such gods. One good example here is the Roman imperial cult, where it was believed that emperors could be deified upon death, though unpopular ones notably were not. I think any variety of ancestor worship would also fit easily into this category. A couple of notes now that we have this list. First, only the omnipotent tier is defined strictly by power level. The others are not, as you could potentially have a very weak tier 2 primordial or a very strong tier 3 regnant. The only difference between these two is that one is within creation and one exists outside of it. In theory, a mortal could ascend beyond the created order, potentially even to omnipotence, as explored in the movie Bruce Almighty. Additionally, there is the question of angels, Valkyrie, and even the Norse version of elves. They don't really fit into this paradigm, since they aren't typically worshipped. They are servants of those who are worshipped. But this is only a rough model. I'm not trying to create a perfect Venn diagram or Cartesian plane of faiths. This is simply one attempt at trying to define divine elements for purposes of helping you figure out your fantasy cosmology. I'm sure some of you are already thinking, what about so-and-so? Or, hey, you forgot such and such. And you're probably right. As we consider these tiers, there are a few additional foundational factors to keep in mind. First, if your world has multiple deities, are they cooperative, combative, or somewhere in between? Tolkien's Valar are an example of a fully cooperative pantheon. Manwë never sabotages Aule, nor does Yavanna slander Varda. They don't always agree, but they never undermine one another. For example, Ulmo argued against bringing the elves to the Blessed Realm, but when he was overruled, he shaped Tol Eressëa to aid their journey to the west. Now, as an aside, I think Ulmo was right, but that's beside the point. Zoroastrianism provides an opposite case, opposing divine forces with irreconcilable aims. Many historical pantheons fall somewhere in the middle, including the Greek and the Norse. While generally cooperative, they still scheme against one another in pursuit of personal ambitions. During the Trojan War, for example, Hera and Athena supported the Greeks, while Aphrodite, Ares, and Apollo backed the Trojans. Loki is the quintessential Norse example. He exists within the pantheon and often works for its benefit, but as the consummate trickster, he frequently messes with them. One variation common in otherwise cooperative pantheons is for a single member to turn against the rest and become the great enemy, such as Morgoth in Tolkien, or Sidon in my own world of Isfalinus. Alternatively, you might have multiple competing pantheons, order versus chaos, good versus evil, fire versus water, or whatever else suits your world. In such circumstances, the deities within a pantheon may be fully cooperative, or a little contentious, but when push comes to shove, they join together to take on the enemy pantheon. Think of feuding families who squabble endlessly until the outside threat appears. Another powerful variation is to include multiple tiers of deities within the same setting. Tolkien has Iluvatar, a Tier 1 omnipotent god, along with the Valar and Maiar, who fit within the Tier 2 primordial category. Greek mythology probably combines Tier 2 and Tier 3, the Titans versus the Olympians, while late-era Roman mythology included Tier 2, Sol Invictus, and Tier 4, apotheosized emperors. As before, these tiers can be cooperative or combative. The Valar, accepting Morgoth, sought to do Iluvatar's will, in contrast to the Tier 3 Olympians, who overthrew and banished the Tier 2 Titans. A major benefit of a multi-tier system is that you can pair staggeringly powerful Tier 1 or Tier 2 deities, who hold the answers to creation and the afterlife, with Tier 3 or Tier 4 deities, who are more worldly, accessible, fallible, and capricious. It's even possible to have all 4 tiers. Now that we've laid some groundwork, let's consider what each tier can actually offer the faithful. When it comes to the afterlife, it is unlikely that Tier 3 or Tier 4 deities can offer any such boon. This is because both regnant and ascendant gods exist within the creative order. How can they grant something beyond a universe they themselves are confined to? The same problem applies to reincarnative faiths. How could a being within creation determine how a soul re-enters that creation, or whether that soul is worthy of apotheosis beyond it? One possible exception is delegated duties from a higher tier. Norse mythology provides a good example. Odin, a Tier 2 deity, establishes the entrance requirements for Valhalla, while the Valkyries carry out the actual selection and retrieval of the worthy. Following this logic, the dominion of Tier 3 and Tier 4 deities would naturally lie within the created order, and they can offer their faithful tangible benefits within that dominion. Apollo and Athena, for example, might aid an army in battle, while Daga, a Celtic fertility god, might provide abundant harvests. Because they exist outside the created order, Tier 1 and Tier 2 deities can offer boons, both related to the afterlife and/or within creation itself. Tier 2 deities often have similar dominions to the 3rd and 4th tier, commonly called portfolios, a term that is far too antiseptic for my tastes, whereas Tier 1s, being omnipotent, have dominion over all things. Finally, let's consider how these deities interact with mortals. It could be directly, or through prophets and oracles, via the conscience, or perhaps by some other mechanism. Let's briefly touch on deific portfolios. These are a staple of pantheons, with each deity taking on specific responsibilities within the world, and sometimes even beyond it, such as heaven or hell. I'm not going to delve deeply here, the options are simply too diverse, but real-world religions reveal 3 consistent patterns. First, overlap is common. Ares, Athena, Zeus, Apollo, and Artemis all have a measure of authority over war. They each are nuanced, but a warrior preparing for battle could reasonably offer a sacrifice to any one of them. Second, a deity's portfolio might include combinations that feel odd, at least to our modern sensibilities. Athena was the goddess of war, wisdom, and weaving. Brigid was the goddess of poetry, healing, and smithing. Third, and most importantly, emphasis is placed on portfolios that matter most to the worshippers. A prime example is the Egyptian pantheon, where many portfolios reflect the central importance of the Nile and the surrounding desert. But what is true? In our own world, confined within the bounds of this universe, we do not have the ultimate answer. That's why we have faith in what we believe. The same is likely true for the inhabitants of your world. There is also value in your audience not knowing, but you, as the world builder, probably should. What is the true nature of the world you've created? Which deities actually exist? Which are deceptive about their true nature? And which, if any, don't exist at all? Our own world contains many mutually exclusive faiths. They cannot all be true. Then again, there could be gradations on the truth. C.S. Lewis commented on his beliefs in our world, saying, "Being a Christian does mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there is only one right answer to a sum, and all other answers are wrong. But some of the wrong answers are much nearer being right than others." You can apply this same logic in your fantasy world through competing interpretations of the same deity or the interrelationship between multiple deities. One of the great challenges of fantasy world building is the tendency for inhabitants to possess far greater cosmological knowledge than we do in our world. And this approach offers a way to reintroduce faith, doubt, and religious debate, or war. I explore this concept in detail in the video called "Who Holds the Truth of Creation?", so I won't take a deep dive here. The point is that variations on the same theme can allow a seemingly singular faith to become multiple faiths, even in a world where there is near perfect knowledge. To give an example, in my world of Fallenness, some among the unaging Astari were created before time began, and therefore possess first-hand knowledge of much of creation and its deities. There is a single Tier 1 omnipotent deity called His Highest Above, and a Tier 3 pantheon known as the Atini. Now I'm simplifying a bit here, but the Atini began as Tier 2 beings, entered the world, and were slain in a war against a rebellious member of their pantheon. The result is a splintering of religious interpretations. Setting aside the critical question of whether the Atini can still influence the world, 3 factions have arisen surrounding the relationship between His Highest Above and the Atini, between Tier 1 and Tier 2 or 3. One faction claims that His Highest Above is a fabrication. Only the Atini ever existed. Another holds that the Atini are mere manifestations of His Highest Above rather than discrete beings. The third maintains the traditional view that His Highest Above created the Atini and delegated various powers and authority to them. Another variation is to create multiple religions that differ in form but share a common root truth. This is sort of the inverse of what C.S. Lewis is suggesting, and is a model the ancient Romans followed. As they expanded their borders and encountered new religions, they often tried to integrate them into their own. This process is known as syncretism. For example, they linked Apollo with the Egyptian god Ra, Mercury to the Celtic god Lu, and Mithras, the Persian god, with Sol Invictus. These were pretty much always linked based on similar portfolios, but sometimes similar religious practices provided bridges as well. For example, the processions and initiations for Diana were similar to those of the Egyptian goddess Isis. You could therefore have humans, or elves, dwarves, or other fantastical peoples, worship similar pantheons under different names with distinct portfolios and religious rites. If you do, though, you might want to consider which one is actually true. Or are they similar enough that the deities can fully adhere to all of them? Does truth ultimately matter? Probably. Establishing an absolute truth helps ensure internal consistency within your world. You don't have to, but you probably will find it very helpful. Again, check out that other video if you're curious about more. I'll provide it in the description. And this brings us back to the greatest pitfall that I see in fantasy world building. It is the easiest way that faith and religion can undermine everything you've created. Disrespect. Whatever faiths you establish for your world, you have to respect them. I don't care if it is the Church of the Digestically Distressed Whale, or if you're writing a scathing satire, or a vociferous polemic. If you don't respect the elements that you introduce into your world, then you will sabotage all of your efforts. I have seen skilled and renowned world builders stumble on this point. 2 groups of world builders are particularly vulnerable to this danger. The first are those who introduce fantasy religions that directly contradict their own beliefs. Since it flies in the face of what they believe, it is hard not to scoff at what they've created. The second group includes world builders who are not religious, or who view religion primarily as a tool of manipulation or control. I'm not belittling anyone who holds that view. We each have free will, and I respect your ability to decide for yourself. I am simply warning you that it can create problems for your world building. So let's explore a bit of how this pitfall can play out. But first, let me clarify what I do not mean. I am not saying that you have to believe or even like what you introduce into your world. Settings and stories have their villains, so it is entirely plausible that you'll be introducing faith systems that are an outright affront to your moral sensibilities. For example, you may decide to have dark religions in your world that include child sacrifice. I think we can all agree that this is terrible, but it also is entirely plausible. It existed in our world, and your world will not collapse in on itself if it exists there too. What I do mean is that every religion you introduce must be internally plausible. There has to be a reason it exists. This brings us back to the incentive, the what's in it for me factor of faith. When the Carthaginians sacrificed children to Baal Hammon, they believed they were ensuring divine goodwill and avoiding divine wrath. While we find that act reprehensible, the motive behind it makes sense. The what's in it for me was fertile crops, the absence of plague, and divine favor. The problem we sometimes run into in fantasy is faith that offers nothing, yet still somehow attracts devoted followers, often to their own detriment. The best example I can think of is the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Steven Erikson, though to be fair, I don't think his mistake is driven by disrespect. I suspect it was more honest than that. He is a very skilled writer, and I've enjoyed his books. I eventually stopped reading the series, but I did complete 7 of his novels, and reread several more than once. The problem he created is specific to Hud, the god of death. Hud offers no meaningful incentive in life, and in death his followers are stacked in a wall of naked moaning corpses. Sounds miserable. This can be avoided by worshipping literally any other god. Why then would anyone choose to follow him? I think I understand what Erikson was shooting for. Exploring powerful themes like the inevitability of death can be quite compelling. But if human behavior doesn't interface with the theme, the audience might consciously or subconsciously question the world's internal logic. Even modest incentives in this world or the next can make a faith credible, but without them, devotion becomes irrational self-denial. It has no reason to exist. Remember the Church of the Digestically Distressed Whale? It is one thing to believe something as true. It is another to invest time, risk, and energy into that belief. As an example solution for Hud, his followers could be offered a less disagreeable fate, and be motivated by the incentive of, I don't want to end up like that. Ultimately, I'm not sure of the reasons behind this mistake. It was likely simply an oversight, one where the full consequences weren't considered. And that's the guiding principle behind this video, and most of my other ones. You can make your fantasy worlds do whatever you want. You are in total control. But if you want plausible worlds that your readers can fully engage with, then it is important to play out the consequences of the choices you introduce. None of us are perfect, and every fantasy world contains some failed logic. But one of our goals should be to minimize it wherever we can. As we approach the end of this video, let's bring it all together. The focus here has been on the individual, internal aspects of religion, the underlying faith. In my next video, we'll look at religion's outward and corporate aspects as they interface with broader society. Ultimately, your world doesn't have to include religion. But if it contains curious peoples, they will seek answers to grand metaphysical questions like, why am I here? And what happens when I die? You don't need to devote a ton of time to this, depending upon your goals for your world, but it probably should be there in some form. The key to making plausible faiths is to ensure that there is a reason for adherents to be devoted to them. That reason takes the form of incentive. What's in it for me in this life, and or what's in it for me after I die? There can be many faiths, beliefs about the nature of the world, that have no incentive, but these faiths won't develop religions around them. There will be no rites, festivals, prayers, tithes, or other religious practices, because nothing comes of them. Next, consider the power of the deities of your world. If there's more than one, how do they relate to one another? Is it cooperative, competitive, or somewhere in between? Are there different tiers of power? What dominion does each deity have within the world, or beyond it? How do deities interact with their followers? Ultimately, what is actually true, and what beliefs arise from a very human desire to explain the world? And most importantly, treat the faiths you establish with respect. Treating them with scorn is the surest way to sabotage the world you've worked so hard to build. If you are interested in exploring the question of truth, particularly about creation, but also faith and religion, check out this video. And also, as I mentioned, my next video will be a deeper dive into corporate religion. If you enjoy this content, please give it a like. What do you think about my new theme music? I want to give a shout out to my friend Jeff, who just gave it an upgrade. Give him a thumbs up if you agree. Also, I would love to hear your thoughts and challenges in introducing faith into your fantasy world. Or which fantasy worlds you think have the coolest religions. Please leave a comment. And until next time, goodbye, happy world building, and have a good day.